The scream came from beneath Blackstone Castle.
Stay
It was a
away from
small
me, you
sound at
beast!
first. A frightened
Merciful
cry
gods,
swallowed
protect
almost
us!
immediately by stone, iron, and darkness. But something heard it.
Stay back, you
Something
foul
that had been
demon!
silent for 12 years. Deep below the castle, behind 3 iron doors and a wall carved from solid mountain rock, an enormous white wolf slowly lifted its head. Its ears moved. Its amber eyes opened. For 12 years,
Please,
the
you
creature
have
had
to
been
trust
chained
me.
inside that underground cage. 12 winters, 12 summers, 12 years of darkness. The soldiers called it a monster. The servants called it the Alpha King's beast. And the oldest guards whispered that it was something far older than the kingdom itself. No one went near its cage. No one touched it. No one even spoke its name. Until tonight. A young healer named Elara had just been thrown into the underground prison. Her wrists were bruised. Her shoulder was bleeding. Rainwater still clung to her hair. And the crime she had been accused of committing was one she had never done. She had stolen medicine from the royal stores. That was the story the king's advisor had told everyone. But Elara knew the truth. Someone had stolen the medicine before she ever touched it. And whoever had framed her was powerful enough to make sure no one believed a poor village healer. The guards shoved her into the darkness. The iron door slammed shut. Elara stumbled backward. Her shoulder struck the wall. Pain tore through her. And before she could stop herself, she screamed. Far below her, a chain snapped. The guards froze. Another chain broke. Then came a sound that made every torch flame tremble. A growl.
Slow, deep.
Hungry, but not for blood. For freedom. Something enormous stood inside the darkness. Something that had been waiting. And when the first iron cage door finally began to bend outward, Elara heard heavy paws approaching her cell. She could not see the creature, but she could feel its breath through the darkness. And then 2 golden eyes appeared beyond the bars. The beast did not attack. It simply stared at her, as if, after 12 years, it had finally found the person it had been waiting for. Veyrath was a kingdom of mountains, forests, frozen rivers, and old legends. Its villages rested in green valleys during summer and disappeared beneath snow during winter, while the northern forests stretched for hundreds of miles toward mountains so high that their peaks were often hidden behind clouds. Wolves had lived there long before the first stone of Blackstone Castle had been laid. The people respected them because the wolves belonged to the forest in a way humans never could. They did not need roads. They did not need walls. They knew when storms were coming, where rivers froze safely, and when strangers entered their territory. But there was one wolf whose name had become almost forbidden. Auren, the White Guardian, the creature that had once been captured after a bloody battle near the northern border. The official story said Auren had killed royal soldiers and murdered the king's younger brother 12 years earlier. King Kaelen had ordered the beast chained beneath Blackstone Castle, where it had remained ever since. No one knew that the truth was very different. No one knew that on the night the prince died, Auren had actually tried to protect him. And no one knew that the only reason the beast had survived was because someone inside the royal court had wanted it alive. Above those forgotten tunnels lived Elara, a young healer who had grown up without wealth or influence, but possessed a kindness that made even frightened animals trust her. She worked from sunrise until late evening in the castle infirmary, preparing herbs, cleaning wounds, and caring for soldiers who rarely remembered her name. She did not complain. Her mother had taught her that kindness was not valuable because people rewarded it. Kindness was valuable because someone always needed it. Elara remembered those words whenever the castle became cruel. On the evening everything changed. A violent storm rolled over Veyrath. Rain struck the castle windows so hard that the glass rattled in its frames. Servants hurried through the corridors carrying candles while guards closed the outer gates. In the royal infirmary, Elara was sorting bottles of medicine when she noticed something wrong. Several bottles of silverleaf tonic were missing. The medicine was expensive and difficult to replace, and without it several wounded soldiers would be left untreated. Elara searched the shelves, then checked the storage records. The numbers did not match. Someone had taken the medicine. She quietly informed the storekeeper, but before anyone could investigate, Lord Malvek arrived with 6 guards. He carried a document bearing the royal seal. His expression was calm, almost pleasant, which frightened Elara more than anger would have. He accused her of stealing the medicine. She denied it. He ordered her room searched. The missing bottles were found beneath her bed. Elara stared at them in disbelief, because she had never seen those bottles before. She tried to explain, but Malvek had already prepared the story. He claimed she had been selling medicine to villagers outside the castle. The guards believed him because he was the king's advisor. Elara looked around the room and saw the faces of servants who wanted to help but were too frightened to speak. She understood immediately that this was larger than stolen medicine. Someone wanted her silent. She was taken away through a forgotten staircase while thunder rolled above the castle. The deeper they descended, the colder the air became. The walls changed from polished stone to ancient rock. Rusted chains hung from the ceiling. Old prison doors appeared in the darkness. Elara noticed claw marks on one of them. She asked where they were taking her. No one answered. Then she heard something behind another iron gate. Breathing. Slow and heavy. The guards exchanged nervous looks. One whispered that they should hurry. Elara's fear grew with every step. At last they reached a massive iron door covered in scratches. The guards unlocked a smaller passage beside it and pushed Elara into a narrow cell. She stumbled and struck her shoulder against the wall. Pain exploded through her arm. A frightened cry escaped her. The guards slammed the door. Then silence returned. For several seconds Elara heard only her own breathing. Then something moved beyond the far wall. She slowly turned toward the sound. Another chain dragged across stone. Somewhere below her, iron screamed. The guards outside suddenly shouted. Elara stepped toward the bars. A distant impact shook dust from the ceiling. Another followed. Then another. Something was breaking free. She heard men running. Someone shouted that the cage had failed. Elara backed away as a final crash echoed through the underground prison. The massive iron door at the end of the corridor buckled outward. A huge white shape appeared behind it. It moved slowly through the smoke and dust. Chains dragged from its body. Blood darkened its shoulder. Its fur was white like winter snow, marked with silver gray around the neck and chest. The creature was enormous, bigger than any wolf Elara had ever seen. Its ears were scarred. One eye carried a faint line across the brow, and its amber eyes were fixed directly upon her. Elara could not breathe. The wolf stopped outside her cell. It could have torn the door apart. Instead, it lowered its head. Elara noticed something then. The beast was injured. A thick iron collar had cut into its neck. Old scars disappeared beneath its fur. The creature looked less like a monster and more like something that had survived years of cruelty. A guard returned with a crossbow. He raised it. Elara reacted without thinking. She stepped between the weapon and the wolf. The guard shouted at her to move. She did not. The wolf's ears lifted. Its eyes softened for the briefest moment. Then the crossbow fired. The bolt struck the beast's shoulder. It roared. The sound shook the entire tunnel. Elara fell backward. The wolf turned toward the guard, but instead of attacking him, it looked back at her. Then it seized the bars of her cell in its jaws. Iron screamed.
Once. Twice.
The lock broke. The door swung open. Elara stood frozen. The beast stepped aside, leaving the path open for her. She did not understand why, but she understood one thing. If she stayed in that cell, she would die. She followed the wolf into the darkness. Elara followed Auren through tunnels that seemed to have no end. Water ran beneath their feet. Cold air rushed through cracks in the stone. Behind them came distant shouting as the castle guards tried to regain control of the underground prison. Auren moved quickly despite the bolt buried in his shoulder, occasionally stopping to listen. Each time he stopped, Elara stopped too. She was terrified of him, but something inside her refused to run. The wolf had opened her cage. It had protected her from the guards. And when it could have attacked, it had chosen not to. At the end of the tunnel, they reached an old drainage passage. Elara crawled through freezing water while Auren followed behind her. The tunnel eventually opened into a forest ravine outside the castle walls. Rain poured through the trees. Elara collapsed against a tree, gasping for breath. Auren stood several steps away. Blood ran down his front leg. Elara looked at him for a long moment before slowly removing her cloak. She tore a strip from the fabric and approached. The wolf growled. She stopped. Then she lowered her eyes and waited. She did not force him. She did not reach for him. She simply sat in the rain. Minutes passed. Auren watched her. Eventually, the wolf lowered himself onto the wet ground. Elara carefully moved closer. She cleaned the wound and wrapped it with the torn cloth. Auren never took his eyes from her. Somewhere beyond the trees, horns sounded. Soldiers were searching for them. Elara knew she could not return to the castle. She also knew the wolf could not survive another attack. They moved deeper into the forest and found an abandoned stone sanctuary hidden between enormous pine trees. Inside were carvings of wolves surrounding a crowned child. Elara ran her fingers over the stone. She recognized a symbol carved beneath the largest wolf. It matched the silver markings beneath Auren's fur. Before she could understand it, footsteps appeared in the mud outside. Someone had followed them. Auren stood instantly. His body became a wall between Elara and the entrance. The wolf growled into the darkness. Elara held her breath. 3 men appeared between the trees. They were not wearing royal armor. They carried hunting bows and long knives. One of them whispered that the beast had to die before sunrise. Elara realized these men were not searching for her. They were hunting Auren. The hunters attacked. Auren moved with terrifying speed. He knocked one man into a tree and forced another to retreat, but the wound in his shoulder slowed him. Elara grabbed a fallen branch and struck one of the hunters when he came too close. It was not enough. They were surrounded. Elara ran toward the river, hoping to draw the hunters away from Auren. The ground beneath her collapsed. She fell through thin ice. Freezing water swallowed her. Her hands clawed at the edge, but the ice broke beneath her fingers. Then Auren plunged into the river. He seized her cloak in his teeth and dragged her toward the shore. The movement reopened his wound. Blood spread through the snow. Elara reached the bank and collapsed. When she opened her eyes, Auren was lying beside her, barely moving. She crawled toward him. Her hands trembled as she pressed against his fur. The enormous wolf lifted his head and touched his nose to her forehead. For the first time, Elara understood that something had changed between them. He had saved her because he had chosen to. Back at Blackstone Castle, King Kaelen stood in the underground prison staring at the broken cage. He remembered the night 12 years earlier. He remembered his brother's blood. He remembered the soldiers screaming that the white beast had attacked. But now he remembered something else. Auren had never attacked him. Not once. The king ordered Captain Rowan to investigate the medicine theft. Rowan returned hours later with troubling news. The evidence against Elara had been prepared before the bottles were reported missing. Someone had planned her arrest. Kaelen's face hardened. He ordered the records searched. The deeper Rowan went, the more inconsistencies he found. Meanwhile, Malvek was already telling the court that Elara had deliberately released the beast. He demanded her death. Kaelen refused to give the order. Instead, he asked one question. Why had the beast escaped only after hearing Elara scream? No one could answer. By dawn, Kaelen had followed a trail into the northern forest. He found the sanctuary. He found Elara unconscious beside the wounded beast. And he found the silver symbol beneath Auren's fur. It was identical to the mark his younger brother had carried since birth. Kaelen took one step forward. Auren immediately stood. The wolf positioned himself between Elara and the king. Kaelen stopped. In the beast's eyes, he saw something that frightened him more than hatred. Recognition. Kaelen did not draw his sword. He simply stood in the snow and stared at the creature that had haunted his memories for 12 years. Auren's lips lifted slightly, revealing his teeth, but he did not attack. Elara slowly woke and found the king standing across from her. She immediately tried to rise, but her legs failed. Kaelen caught her before she fell. Auren growled.
Kaelen released her at once.
That small movement told Elara something about the king. He could have commanded his soldiers to seize her. Instead, he stepped back. Captain Rowan arrived behind him carrying an old leather case. Inside were documents recovered from the castle archives. The papers changed everything. Auren had not been captured for killing the prince. He had been captured after carrying the prince's infant son away from an ambush. The royal convoy had been attacked by men wearing rebel colors, but the records show those men had actually belonged to Malvek's family. The official story had been forged. Kaelen's brother had been murdered during an attempted coup. Auren had witnessed it. That was why he had been kept alive. Someone needed to know where the evidence was hidden. Elara listened silently while Kaelen struggled to accept the truth. His hands shook as he held the old document. For 12 years he had believed that grief was punishment enough. Now, he realized his grief had been built upon a lie. Auren had not killed his brother. He had protected his family. The king lowered his eyes. The wolf watched him carefully. Then Auren turned toward Elara. The movement was small, but Kaelen understood. The beast trusted her, not him. They returned to the old monastery in the mountains because Rowan discovered that the wolf symbols in the sanctuary belonged to an ancient order called the Wolf Keepers. There they met Mara, an old woman who had spent most of her life protecting the forgotten traditions of the northern clans. She recognized Auren immediately. Tears filled her eyes when she saw the scar around his neck. She explained that Auren was the last White Guardian, a wolf bound by an ancient oath to protect the royal bloodline when danger came from within the kingdom. The bond was not magic in the way court legends described it. It was older and simpler. The Guardian chose whom to protect. Auren had chosen Elara because she had shown him kindness when every other human had shown him fear. Mara also revealed another secret. The infant prince Auren had saved 12 years earlier was still alive. He had been raised inside the royal household. He was now the heir to Verath. Elara looked toward Kaelen. The king's face had gone pale. His son had survived because of the creature he had imprisoned. Before they could discuss what to do next, horses thundered outside. Malvek's men had found them. The monastery came under attack. Arrows struck the wooden walls. Auren moved through the doorway before anyone could stop him. He fought like an animal that knew every movement was necessary. Elara treated wounded soldiers while Kaelen fought beside Rowan. For the first time, king and beast stood on the same side. Then an arrow flew toward Elara. Auren crossed the courtyard and took it in his side. He collapsed. Elara ran to him. Kaelen helped carry the wounded wolf inside. His hands became covered in Auren's blood. He stared at the red stains as if they were a punishment. Elara looked at him and saw the grief in his face. She did not comfort him with words. She simply placed a cloth in his hand and showed him where to press the wound. Together, they saved the beast. Later that night, Kaelen admitted that he had spent 12 years hating Auren because hatred was easier than accepting that he had failed his brother. Elara listened. She did not excuse him. She did not condemn him. She simply stayed. That was what she had always done. Stayed when others walked away. As dawn approached, Mara warned them that Malvek was preparing to assassinate Kaelen during the moon crown ceremony. He planned to blame the murder on Auren and use the panic to seize control of the kingdom. They had only one chance. They had to return to Blackstone Castle before the ceremony. But when they left the monastery, Auren suddenly stopped. His ears pointed toward the mountain pass. Men appeared on every ridge. They were surrounded. Elara looked back at Mara. The old woman looked devastated. Auren growled at her. For one terrible moment, Elara wondered whether the wolf had been warning them all along. Mara finally confessed that Malvek had taken villagers from her mountain home hostage. He had threatened to kill them if she refused to reveal the group's location. She had not betrayed them willingly. She had been trapped. Kaelen did not punish her. Instead, he promised to free the villagers. It was the first time Elara saw him choose mercy, when revenge would have been easier. They escaped through a narrow mountain trail and returned to Blackstone Castle before the moon crown ceremony. The kingdom had gathered beneath thousands of lanterns. Nobles filled the great hall. Soldiers lined the walls. Music echoed through the castle. And at the center of it all stood Malvek. He welcomed the king with a smile that did not reach his eyes. Captain Rowan was missing. Malvek had captured him. He demanded that Kaelen publicly declare Auren a monster responsible for his brother's death. Kaelen refused. He walked into the throne room with Elara beside him and Auren behind them. The nobles fell silent. Many reached for their weapons. The white wolf stood calmly beneath the great stone pillars. Malvek shouted that the creature had escaped and attacked soldiers. Kaelen answered by ordering Rowan's captors to bring forward the old royal records. Evidence of the coup was revealed. Names were read. Orders were uncovered. Seals were compared. Witnesses stepped forward. The court slowly realized that Malvek's family had controlled the kingdom through a lie for 12 years. Malvek panicked. He released trained war hounds into the hall, hoping they would attack Auren and prove the wolf was uncontrollable. The hounds charged. Auren stood between them and Elara. He did not chase them. He waited. When the first animal lunged, Auren moved with precision, knocking it aside without killing it. The others hesitated. Elara realized he was not fighting from hatred. He was protecting her. One of the hounds attacked from behind. Elara pushed Auren aside and was struck by falling stone when the ancient balcony cracked. She disappeared beneath the rubble. Auren screamed. He clawed through the stones until his paws bled. Kaelen tried to pull him away. The wolf refused. Together they freed Elara. She was unconscious, but alive. Auren lowered his head beside her. Kaelen knelt too. For the first time, the king touched the beast without fear. His hand rested against Auren's scarred neck. The wolf did not pull away. Malvek ran. Rowan caught him before he reached the outer gate. But the advisor had one final plan. He ignited the underground storage chambers. Fire spread through the ancient tunnels. The prison beneath the castle began to collapse. Elara was still weak. Auren was injured. Kaelen had a choice. He could remain above and protect the throne, or descend into the collapsing tunnels to save the people who had exposed the truth. He removed the ceremonial crown from his head. Then he walked into the smoke. Elara followed. Auren followed her. The three of them entered the darkness, where everything had begun. Stone fell around them. Fire roared through the tunnels. The old cage collapsed behind them. Elara remembered the night she had screamed. She remembered the creature coming toward her. She remembered being terrified. Now Auren walked beside her freely. They reached the ancient drainage passage just before the ceiling collapsed. Kaelen pushed Elara through the opening. Auren followed. The mountain shook behind them. Then silence. At sunrise, Blackstone Castle stood above a ruined entrance. The king emerged covered in ash. Elara walked beside him. Auren followed. The people of Verath gathered in stunned silence. For 12 years they had believed the white wolf was a monster. Now they watched the creature stand peacefully beside the woman who had saved it. Kaelen told them the truth. He admitted his own failure. He admitted that the kingdom had imprisoned its guardian. And he promised that the old lies would never return. But when the sun rose higher, Auren turned toward the northern mountains. He began walking away. After several steps, he stopped. He looked back at Elara. She understood. He was not asking her to remain. He was asking whether she would follow. The journey north was quieter than the journey south had been. There were no soldiers behind them, no hunters, no chains, only snow, wind, and the steady sound of Auren's paws crossing the frozen ground. Elara walked beside him while Kaelen followed several steps behind. The king had returned to the castle long enough to arrange the rebuilding of the kingdom, but he had chosen to accompany them one final time. He needed to see where the old story had begun. Auren led them to a hidden valley beyond the northern forest. There stood an ancient stone circle surrounded by pine trees. At its center was a monument carved with the image of a white wolf standing beside a crowned child. Mara had followed them there. She explained that this was where the original oath between the first Alpha King and the Northern Wolves had been made. The Guardian had never belonged to the crown. The Guardian belonged to the people. That was why Malvek had feared him. Auren could not be controlled. He could only choose. Elara placed her hand against the ancient stone. She understood then why Auren had broken free when he heard her scream. He had recognized something in her pain. Not weakness. not fear. A plea for someone to come. For 12 years he had heard human voices filled with commands, threats, and hatred. Hers had been different. It had been the first voice that sounded like his own suffering. Kaelen stood quietly nearby. He admitted that he had wanted to keep Auren at the castle after everything happened. He believed the beast could protect the kingdom. Elara told him that protection was not the same as imprisonment. The king understood. He promised that Auren would never wear another chain. The following months changed Verath. The underground prison was opened. The cells were destroyed. The old wolf laws were restored. Hunters were forbidden from killing wolves in the northern forests. The villagers who had been taken hostage were freed. Mara returned home. Captain Rowan became guardian of the northern border. And Kaelen publicly admitted the crimes that had happened under his reign. It was not easy. Some nobles wanted silence. Others wanted revenge. But the king refused both. Justice, he said, had to mean truth. Elara established a small healing house near the forest. She treated villagers, travelers, soldiers, and injured animals. She asked no one for payment if they could not afford it. Auren often disappeared into the mountains for days. Then, without warning, he would return and wait outside the healing house at sunrise. Children slowly stopped fearing him. They began leaving pieces of bread near the trees. Farmers stopped chasing him away. And, eventually people began calling him something different. Not the Alpha King's beast. The White Guardian. One evening, Elara found a small boy sitting outside the healing house. He was crying because his injured dog was dying. Elara knelt beside him and treated the animal. Auren watched from the forest. When the dog survived, the boy ran toward the wolf. Elara feared he would frighten Auren, but the wolf lowered his head. The boy touched his fur. Auren remained perfectly still. Elara smiled. The kingdom was changing. Not because someone had ordered it to change. Because people were learning. Winter arrived again. Snow covered the mountains. The first anniversary of Malvec's fall was celebrated with lanterns throughout the kingdom. People placed lights along the road from Blackstone Castle to the northern forest. Elara walked beneath them alone. Auren waited among the trees. His white fur shone beneath the moon. She remembered the girl who had entered the underground prison trembling with fear. She remembered the cage, the chains, the scream. She remembered the first moment those amber eyes had looked at her. Auren stepped toward her. He no longer wore the iron collar. Only a pale scar remained around his neck. Elara reached out. The wolf touched his nose to her palm. She closed her eyes. Freedom had not erased his scars. It had simply stopped the scars from becoming his future. Behind her, footsteps approached. Kaelen stood beneath the lanterns. He did not interrupt them. He simply smiled. Elara looked toward the king, and then toward Auren. The wolf walked between them. For the first time there was no cage. No command. No fear. Only choice. Years later, travelers would tell the story differently. Some would say a young healer had broken the strongest curse in Verath. Some would say the White Guardian had chosen his queen. Children would whisper that Auren could understand every human word. Old hunters would shake their heads and say the wolf was older than the mountains. But Elara knew the truth was much simpler. Auren had not needed a hero. He had needed someone willing to see him. Blackstone Castle changed after that winter. The underground prison was never rebuilt. Its iron doors were melted down and turned into bridges. The stone chambers became storage rooms, then workshops, and eventually places where children could learn the history that the kingdom had once tried to forget. The story of Malvec became a warning. The story of Kaelen became a lesson in humility. And the story of Auren became something the people carried in their hearts. Every spring, the villagers gathered at the edge of the northern forest. They brought food. They brought lanterns. They brought flowers. No one was allowed to hunt there anymore. The forest belonged to the wolves again. Elara remained beside it. Her healing house grew into a small village of its own. People came from distant valleys to learn from her. She taught young healers that medicine was not only about herbs and bandages. Sometimes the first thing a wounded creature needed was someone who would sit quietly beside it. Kaelen visited often. Their relationship had never been hurried. There had been no sudden promises, no grand declaration. Their bond grew slowly, like the trees beyond the healing house. He helped rebuild bridges. She cared for the people who crossed them. He learned to listen. She learned that not every person wearing a crown was cruel. And Auren watched them both. One autumn morning, Elara woke before sunrise. The air was cold. Frost covered the windows. She stepped outside and found Auren waiting near the trees. He looked older now. Silver had appeared around his muzzle. The scar around his neck was still visible, but his eyes remained the same. Amber.
Calm.
Knowing. Elara approached. Auren lowered his head. She placed her hand against his fur. For a long moment neither moved. Then, somewhere deep inside the forest, another wolf howled. Auren lifted his head. A second howl answered. Then a third. The sound traveled through the trees and across the valley. Elara smiled. There had once been a time when people believed the sound of wolves meant danger. Now the people of Verath heard it and thought of freedom. Auren turned toward the mountains. He took several steps, then stopped. Elara knew what he was doing.
He was saying goodbye.
Not forever.
Just for now.
She stepped closer. Her fingers rested briefly against the scar on his neck. The mark was proof of what had happened. But it was no longer a symbol of imprisonment. It was a reminder that he had survived. Auren looked at her one final time. Then he disappeared into the trees. Elara watched until the last trace of white fur vanished among the pines. Behind her, the castle bells began ringing. Morning had arrived. The kingdom was awake. Children were running through the village. Smoke rose from chimneys. Farmers opened their gates. Somewhere beyond the northern ridge, wolves moved freely beneath the rising sun. And Elara stood there listening. She remembered that first night. The underground chamber. The cold stone.
The fear.
Her scream. And then those amber eyes. She had once believed that something terrible had heard her cry. She had been wrong. Something wounded had heard her. Something imprisoned had heard her. Something that had spent 12 years waiting in darkness had heard one human voice that did not demand anything from it. And it had answered. Not with violence. Not with blood. But with freedom. The strongest creature beneath the Alpha King's castle had never truly been a monster. The monster had been the cage. The monster had been the lie. The monster had been the fear that convinced an entire kingdom to stop looking closely at the truth. And sometimes, the smallest act of kindness was enough to break all three. Elara turned toward the forest one last time. A distant wolf howled. She smiled. Then she walked home beneath the morning light. And far beyond the trees, where the mountains rose white against the sky, Auren walked freely through the snow. No chains followed him. No guards waited for him. No iron doors stood between him and the world. For the first time in 12 years, the White Guardian belonged only to himself. And somewhere beneath the ruined castle, where the old cage had once stood, the silence finally felt peaceful. Because the scream that had once echoed through darkness had not awakened a beast. It had awakened a kingdom, and the kingdom had finally learned how to listen.